So it was just the Temu knockoff version of Matrix from the outset. I became much more interested when they started kind of going down the trail of like
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us our co-host, Andrew, to review the fourth and final installment in the Matrix Revolution series, whatever you want to call it. All of the Matrixes are coming to a final conclusion in what showed up in 2021. That's what we're talking about, The Matrix Resurrections, the 2021 American science fiction action film, which was written and directed by Lana Wachowski, and it was also co-written by David Mitchell and Alexander Hemmon. As always, we want those initial thoughts and ratings. So, Andrew, what are your thoughts? Are you going to give this one a glowing rating, the rating we've been waiting for this entire series?
perfect 9 out of 9 is what I would say if I were high. Actually, I probably wouldn't even say it then, to be completely honest. I think this movie had some interesting ideas in the beginning. Like going into it, it was enough to get my attention. It did not hold my attention in terms of like pulling me in, I guess is the right way to say it. I think it had good ideas, terrible execution, which unfortunately is a lot of films, or a lot of the takes that I have for some of the films we've done. I ended up giving this movie a 3.
Okay. So, I'm going to be honest, I was expecting a half a point total from you on this one. So, the fact that you gave it any points here is pretty good. I, for myself, thought that there was, in a similar vein, I thought there were some ideas that they had here that at least were more interesting than I expected, to be honest. They had some ideas that were new, that were in some ways innovative. I think that there is, in a lot of ways, though, at the end of the day, this film undermines a lot of the rest of the franchise and what it was trying to do, and the conclusions it comes to is nothing that anyone who's a fan of the series previously wanted, and even anyone who's a casual moviegoer truly wanted either. So, what we are left with in my rating is a 2.15. So, we'll get into why we got those ratings today, but if you're curious, keep listening. Otherwise, we're going to go full steam ahead right after Andrew gives us a summary of what The Matrix Resurrections is all about.
Movie starts out with a almost shot-for-shot replay of the opening scene from the first Matrix movie, with Trinity engaging with the Enforcers, or whatever they're called. You are then introduced to the new cast and ensemble of characters, and then you are reintroduced to the character of Neo, who is currently being convinced that the Matrix and everything that happened in them was simply a video game, and he's slowly losing his mind, and he's being forced to take these blue pills in order to curb his psychotic breaks, as they put it. As the film progresses, you realize that no, these are not psychotic breaks, he's actually in a new Matrix, and they're just keeping him there, and they're controlling him and using his connection to Trinity to power the Matrix. And he breaks free, and then he breaks Trinity free, and they have the power of love wins out.
Yes. If that's any hint as to where this is going, there you go. We're going to get right into it, as we always do. We have that opening scene, just like Andrew outlined, where they recreate the scene from the original film with Trinity fighting the different military, or actually they're not military personnel, they're just police, and then you see the agents walking up. But this time you see that there are people who are on the sidelines watching, and then you see them break out this character of Morpheus reappearing as a new form of Morpheus, and then it cuts to Neo making this game known as the Matrix and making lots of money from it, and him questioning whether or not all that has happened before has been part of just a game that he created, rather than being part of the reality and having the being illuminated like we had been led to believe in the previous 3 films. What are your thoughts on the opening of this film?
initially the film is uninteresting. Like the opening sequence, I think, did not captivate me. It felt like, I don't know how to explain it perfectly, but it was giving like wannabe Matrix. And as someone who, like, the action in Matrix isn't bad, I think it's just long and drawn out. It felt like there were just people who wanted to do a recreation. So it was just the Temu knockoff version of Matrix from the outset. I became much more interested when they started kind of going down the trail of like, did Neo dream all of this up, or is he being controlled in the Matrix right now? That's when I actually began to become interested in where this film was taking things.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of the problem of what you're seeing is something we've seen in a lot of films, especially in the last 10 years. A lot of that you've seen, especially in the Marvel movies, but you see it again here, where they introduce you to a scene that reestablishes you in that universe and shows you what is going on, what is interesting about this universe, what is reestablishing the characters, reestablishing the world we're in, reestablishing what to expect in the film. And so in a lot of ways, them introducing us with this scene was meant to do that. Now, what does it add? It adds Morpheus as a character with a new face and all of this other stuff. I personally think that this is one of the worst openers I have seen in a long time. And I think part of that is because, frankly, one, we don't need this introduction of Morpheus. They reintroduce Morpheus anyways later in the film to Neo in a new light. And that was enough for us as audience to get reconnected to the character. Now, recasting him, you can talk about whether or not that was a good choice or not. Personally, I think it wasn't and was totally unnecessary. But if you want to go that route, they could still do that with the reintroduction they do later. In regards to the value that it adds beyond that, it doesn't add anything. And if anything, it undermines the premise they try to get you to believe at later, like at the very next part of the film, which is this idea that Neo may have been basically dreaming up everything that happened before, that everything we've seen before in the last 3 films is not true. It was basically just a video game that we were watching play out. And the idea of Neo was he was just this gamer dude who created this universe. And so we have been living in a lie in the same way that Neo was living in a lie by believing that these films were real, or like buying the premise that these films could have existed in this universe. So I think that in showing the Matrix aspect of it again, they undermine that and make you led to believe that the Matrix is still false. Now, they do a decent job. We'll get into the next part as to why I think that that's not wholly true, but as a flashpoint, if you will, this flashpoint is very strongly indicating that the Matrix is still there, the Matrix is still real, and in some ways, I think this undermines the very next part. But let's get into that next part. What are your thoughts on the reintroduction of Neo and the gamer aspect of the Matrix?
I think this is the only good part of this movie. I think there are parts that are like digestible, if that makes sense. Like they're there and it's like, it's not terrible. It's not, some of them aren't bad, but they're not really good either. This is the only part of the movie where I, as the viewer, and thinking through like, how am I going, like, how does this fit into each of the points of the 9-point system? It was the only part where I went, okay, this is actually interesting. The ideas they're playing with, the take they're going with this film is different. Now, what they end up doing with it later, completely different story. But the way that they handle it initially with kind of dealing with the idea of, is this all just a figment of your imagination, I think is very interesting, considering the original movies were dealing with the idea of almost like conspiracy theories. Like, are you gonna become red pilled and accept that the world you live in is a lie? And then this film kind of flips all of that on its head with this portion specifically, in that you as the viewer are meant to start questioning whether or not the truth you had accepted to be true is in fact real, if that makes sense.
It's like an Uno reverse of what we had seen from all of the previous films. That you say, oh, reality is a lie. Well, now this reality that you thought was now revealed to be true is also a lie, and you're back to the square one that you originally thought.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
I will say, I'm not entirely sure what your take is on this. You did say you don't think it completely undermines it. I think, depending on how this goes, I may end up playing devil's advocate a little bit for the opening scene, not being in that I don't think it completely undermines this premise, although I do think that the beginning scene is unnecessary. I don't think it's needed.
Well, yes, and leading right into that, I think it detracts from this part of the film, because I do agree that they deal with interesting ideas here, and if you're going to go with this premise, you might as well go 100% invested into it from the start, rather than giving us this flashpoint that maybe it's not what we're about to see is true, right? And so this idea, if you just start with the premise that Neo has been living a lie in the previous 3 films, and he is just this gamer guy who has developed this game that everyone loves called The Matrix, and everything we've seen previously was not actually real, it was just a game we were watching on a screen, it makes you believe, okay, well, maybe it makes you question everything, right? And so I think that they do well enough in the film to make you believe, even with that opening scene, maybe it is still a game, right? And I think that if you take that from just like a common man perspective, especially, not reading into it from like an analytical technique like we're trying to do here, it's a lot more viable that that's potentially what's going on here. And that even with that devil's advocate aspect and the over analyzation that you might say we're taking here, you can still probably come to the conclusion that they do well enough at this part that you still have some questions that maybe Neo was actually hallucinating the first 3 films, if you will, rather than them being real. So I think that they do decently at the film. And once again, I think that we're actually in full agreement that this part of the film is one of the stronger parts where they do have this question. My only other gripe with it is that if you take this premise, right, that you're going, that everything that has been led before us is a lie, in some ways you undermine the first 3 films and say that they're not truly meaningful because they're just a game, and that the messages and ideas they're presented are not true. Yeah, I mean, for one, you're probably going to alienate a lot of the audiences from the first 3 films, because then you're disingenuously telling them that it's not real. But then secondarily, I think they also undermine themselves later by showing it is in fact a lie. So for as much as it is an interesting side foray into an interesting idea, they end up saying, yeah, no, this isn't true. Pretty, I wouldn't say fairly quickly, probably about a third of the way into the film, you realize, yeah, this is not the way it's supposed to be. So it's one of many scenes that you see in this film where they take an idea that's new, that's interesting, and they play with it just enough that you go, okay, I'm curious to see where this goes, and they kind of just throw it away. So that's more of my problem with this, is that they take it and they go with this idea and they say, yeah, no, that's not actually the case, pretty quickly.
Do you think there's any instance in which this movie would have worked with this premise if they had committed to it more, or do you think that would have still completely undermined? Like let's say it still ends up being false. Like he's still being lied to, that he's crazy, but they commit to it more. Do you think there's a version of this movie in which it is better? Does it make sense?
Sure. I think that some of this is wrapped up in how they portray everything else, right? And so it's not just that this piece itself is a killer piece, if you will. The problem with this is that if you're going to go down this route and you say that they created a whole new world, like they ended up doing, right? The Analyst has created this whole new Matrix with all these new rules of how the game is played. You still want to make sure it's fairly strongly anchored in other ways to the previous film so we can still buy it. I think a good example of that is completely remaking the character of Agent Smith. You don't want to do that if you're going to anchor it in this whole new world, but still keep some semblance of the original creation. Either one, leave Agent Smith dead, or 2, keep Agent Smith as the character he was previously, right? He has reinsinuated himself into this new Matrix, or keep the Oracle there, or keep the Architect there. These other characters, you want to make sure that people are still grounded in the previous world. Otherwise, you start to have a world very similar to what we saw with, what's the film I'm thinking of? Tron Ares, right?
Yeah.
Where they take it and they make it completely new. It's completely different. It's completely, in some ways, almost completely disconnected from the previous world, except for a few characters that they show in there. Now, this one I would say is better than Tron Ares in keeping it connected, but not by much. You have Neo there and you have Trinity there. Great. Other than that, there's nothing that's interconnecting us to it like they are previously. And the benefit it has in this film compared to Tron Ares is that the main characters are still in this film, versus in Tron Ares, the main character of Flynn shows up for a cameo and that's it. So,
Well, actually, Flynn doesn't show up because it's not Flynn.
Okay. Well, you know what I'm saying here is that it's like he's
they don't
barely
show up,
a part of the
neither
film.
does Tron. Like it, yeah, I agree. And right, you're right that it doesn't beat it out by much too, because it's like what we gave Tron Ares maybe a point. You're giving it 2. I gave it 3 off rip. So yeah, a point or 2 is not much when you're talking below 4.5 points.
Yeah, so I mean that's more of where my beef goes with it. Is I think that it becomes just disconnected enough that people start to see it as, in some ways, a completely different a film. So we'll get into that more as we get into the other characters, because I think the other characters play into this even more so. But for the sake of this element of the film, this idea that they created this whole new world underneath the guise of the Analyst, recreating it, I think that they developed interesting ideas, and it could have gone very interesting places. They just didn't actually terminate those in a satisfying way. And we'll get to why they didn't terminate those satisfactorily as we progress in this analysis. But let's talk about Neo. What are your thoughts on Neo in this film as he's reintroduced? He's got the long hair now. He's this guy who's developing games. Do you think he's a compelling protagonist?
Initially. It's kind of like the reverse of what he was in the first movie, where he starts out thinking that everything's a lie, but he's living in a falsehood, and he's trying to reach reality. And in this one, it's like reversed. He's living in a falsehood, and he thinks that reality is a lie.
Yeah.
So I think the premise of his character, again, best part of this movie is the stage they're setting up in my mind. And then as the film progresses, he kind of just he just plateaus. He doesn't really have an arc at all. His entire arc was just, is this real or is it not? If it's real, then I fight the machines. And then he transforms from being someone with the goal of fighting the machines to being more of just this symbol-esque character. Same thing with Trinity. I don't think Trinity gets any development in this film. They try to give her like this little is she, isn't she moment, gonna like question reality, and then they turn into Superman and Supergirl, or Superman and I don't even know what, because technically that's incest, but anyways. You get my point.
Yeah. I mean, I think in regards to Neo, for sure, the beginning is interesting. He starts out questioning reality, and that in some ways he questions if what they're presenting to him is true. And once again, it is more interesting and actually makes sense to the idea if you just take it from the baseline of, in the first one, Neo is presented as a younger character, right? In this one, he's presented as an older character. And from a baseline, it's very understandable that someone who's lived in a world longer is generally more willing to accept the world they've lived in because they've lived in it for so long, versus as a younger person, you're more likely to question things. There's this idea that you are trying to question everything and trying to develop your own ideas of the world and everything like that. And you get the idea in the first couple of films that Neo is at that stage where he is young enough to be questioning everything, to be in that young, somewhat rebellious stage of his life, even though he's just started on his career and is still somewhat along in his life, he's not gotten to that full conclusion where everything's figured out. Versus in this one, he's established, he has his company, he has his business, he's doing all of his things. He's more or less, the only thing he doesn't have in his life is this love aspect of his life that he hasn't quite clicked into place. And so when you come to, say, a 50-year-old man and tell him that everything you've believed for 50 years is a lie, the general impression you get is that's going to be harder to convince them that that's true than someone who's, say, 25 years down the road, 28 years down the road, or 30, whatever you would say for the original Neo in the first film. And so that in and of itself is more compelling as a starting baseline to see why the Neo in this one is more reticent to take the pill and to see reality than the Neo in the first film, who was already questioning everything and was a lot younger. But then after that, once he gets freed, he turns into this, oh my goodness, wifey Trinity, where is she? I need her. And then it just turns into that for the rest of the film. And you get back to this baseline of, well, for the sake of love, I will do whatever it takes, including screwing everyone else. And that becomes the premise for the rest of the film. And from there, like you said, he plateaus. So I think it's like, it's all so unfortunate that everything that was interesting about this film happens in like the first third of the film, and then after that it just goes and just dies. So,
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with you there. I think it's like you've got, what is it, like 2 hours? First 10 minutes, garbage. The 10 minutes to 30-minute marker or 35-minute marker, good. 35-minute marker onward is just like dive headfirst into a drained pool.
Yeah. But at the same time, you're introduced to some new characters. One, you have the recreation of Agent Smith as the stereotypical Aryan race character-esque, where they say is, quote-unquote, the perfect being, in the words of Agent Smith. And two, you have the character of the Analyst. So what are your thoughts on these two villains? Do you think that they are compelling? Do you think they're not?
The second I saw Barney Stinson, I knew something was up. I was like, there's no way this therapist, one, is just an innocent bystander, and two, there's no way he's going to be playing some sort of like maniacal villain. He is going to be like the I'm full of myself villain. Other than seeing Barney Stinson on the screen for like the first 2 seconds, I don't think his character was that interesting. Agent Smith, I hated. We talked about this with the third one, right? With, I forget who the guy's name is, but the guy who gets like possessed by Smith.
Bane?
Yes, that was fantastic portrayal of like how Smith should act, talk, walk, everything. This guy was just a fruity Smith. Like he was not Agent Smith. He didn't talk the same. His diction was like completely different. The words he's using, his tone was different. The way he carried himself was different. Like the only reason we know it's Smith is because he says he's Smith. Nothing about like when it came to Bane, we knew it was Smith because of the way he acted. And like there were just so many subtle clues we got from that we as the audience knew it was him before he ever said it was him. The fact that he has to say, I am Smith, is how you go, oh, okay, yeah. Same thing with Morpheus, by the way.
Yeah.
So, I thought he was terrible.
Yeah. Agent Smith is definitely one of the big L's in this film. Partially because what you just said. There is a very almost like palpable aspect to who Agent Smith is and how he speaks, to the way that Hugo Weaving plays him, to the way that he says, Mr. Anderson, and you know that he's there to take out Neo and take control of everything in the Matrix. Versus in this one, you see he's saying, well, you see, Tom, I'm here because I'm imprisoned again, and I hate you, and I hate everyone who's controlling me. And so you get this idea that he's just a more friendly buddy version, and they play it off as saying, well, you know, he's a smarter, more developed version of him. okay. I mean,
He
it leads to a
wasn't-
couple of questions. One, why is he even introduced to the Matrix again? Like, why did they recreate this character of Agent Smith at all? Why not use a different agent? If they know that Agent Smith is potentially a threat to the Matrix, why is he here? Why would they put him back into the Matrix and recreate him? I mean, he got destroyed in the last one. Why
Yeah.
not leave him dead? But then beyond that, it's just he's not the same character we've known previously. So to recreate him underneath this new form and to say that this is the character we've known previously, I just didn't think it was viable from a character development standpoint. Beyond that, it's just so unclear, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but it's so unclear to me why they made Agent Smith ally with Neo.
Oh, I know. I asked when we were watching the movie, why? Like, other than the shock factor of him shooting him in the head, the analyst, I think,
Mm-hmm.
we get no indication that he wanted to ally. He was literally beating the living crap out of Neo like 30 minutes before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And nothing he did insinuated that he wanted him alive or wanted to ally with him. It looked like he wanted to kill Neo. He picked up a freaking sink and was going to smash it over his head. I think he did. Maybe, I don't know. At that point, I just tuned out. Maybe. So yeah, he like showed up and I was like, oh. I mean, at this point in the movie, it's gotten so bad, I'm not surprised, but
Yeah.
I also agree, like, why bring him back? Literally, they ally themselves with Neo at the end of the third one to kill him.
Mm-hmm. And part of the thing, too, is it undermines the third one by doing that, because part of it is this idea that he sacrificed himself to save the Matrix, and this idea of karma that they were going with the last one, where there's an equal and opposite force that is out there, and there needs to be some level of balance in the universe. You could argue, okay, maybe that he needed to be there for the balancing aspect of the universe, but at the same time, they already established that there was a balancing aspect of this new Matrix, and that was this dichotomy between Trinity and Neo in this version, rather than the previous dichotomy of Neo and Agent Smith. So it's not necessary in this version of the universe for Agent Smith to exist. So why is he there?
Yeah.
And I don't know. And he honestly doesn't add anything other than coming in, shooting the analyst, and then leaving. And then you go, okay, well, whoa, why?
Oh, yeah, that's the other thing. He just ups and leaves afterwards.
Yeah.
And he just goes, it's like the be seeing ya, John moment, where he's just like, see you later, bud. I feel this is where our partnership comes to an end. I didn't even know you had a partnership, buddy. I wrote down a list of things this movie does not have. There is no fear in the audience that the goals will be attained. There are no consequences. There is no irreversible loss. There is no transformation, and there is no emotional climax. The most emotion I felt in that film was when people started hurling their entire body onto the street going, what the flip? I was like, why didn't the wife jump too? If you're purely trying to bomb him with bodies, you might as well use all the ones you have at your disposal. But no, we're just going to have the husband do it and like a few random kids. Okay.
Yeah, the amount of just bizarre consequences and actions that occur, which is also in contrast to the previous films as well, because especially in the first film and the third film, you see that the sacrifice that occurs for the protagonist to win the day is pretty significant. Even if you're not completely bought into some of the characters that die, you still can't deny that hundreds of people die in the attack against Zion in the third film, or in the first film. Almost the entire crew, which is trying to infiltrate and to get Neo out of there, ends up dying, except for Neo and Trinity and Morpheus, right? And the one guy who helps them fly back to Zion. So everyone else, a good half or if not 2/3 of the people who are on that ship end up dying as a consequence of trying to achieve the story goal. And so there's a real sense of loss that occurs in the middle of those films. Because this is a sequel, you have a baseline of the sacrifice that can occur to create the problems in this film, if you will. And this is the problem with sequels, is that if you're going to create escalating stakes, we already know how bad it can be. And so you have almost some prerogative, some responsibility to make it worse when you're creating that story. This is one of the problems we talked about a lot when it came to the Marvel films, where they came to this point where they go, okay, how many times can you say the entire universe is going to die before we as the audience just stop believing it? Because you can't get any worse than the entire universe dying. So it's just, once you get to that point, it can't get any worse. And in this case, not only does it not even hit that baseline, it goes below it. Because who do we lose? Anyone? Maybe one or two side characters? I don't even remember anyone dying in this film who was meaningful at all to the plot. Maybe one or two of the side characters die, but Bugs doesn't die, who's one of the critical side characters. Morpheus doesn't die. Trinity doesn't die. Neo doesn't die. Like, everyone lives and lives happily ever after. So,
actually, not
so
even
much
the
for
villains
sacrifice.
die in this film. Nobody dies. Death is an illusion.
Right, exactly.
Quite literally, because we thought the Barney Stinson character had died, but then we found out he didn't. So
Yes, he's a program. He can't die. Machines do not die.
that means Tron isn't dead.
Well, we kind of assume that at that point by the end of that film.
Yes,
That's a different film. That's not this one.
I'd rather talk about it though.
Yeah, so the film progresses to the point where they're trying to free Trinity, and Trinity, or Tiffany as she's called in this new Matrix, and they say, oh, well, in order to free her, she has to be almost acquiesced to it in her mind. And so then Neo goes, all right, I'll talk to her in front of the Analyst and I'll tell her the truth, and she has to agree that she needs to be freed in order for her to be freed. And they bring her there, and she goes, oh, no, I think this world is real, and starts to walk away. And then 5 seconds later goes, you know what? No, this world is fake, and decides to end up allying herself with Neo at the end of the film. What are your thoughts on Trinity in this film? Do you think that her, as a critical part of this film, is a compelling dynamic in this film?
Outside of the beginning, I know. Like that first scene with her where she's in the coffee shop and then he meets her husband, like that was interesting. Not so much for Trinity's character, but for Neo's. And then after that, no. I find the whole, like, the idea that their love is, like, keeping the Matrix, like, power levels up, like, so weird. And then you've got, like, we can't let them get too close, otherwise an atomic bomb will go off that puts Hiroshima to shame. And then, but if we put them too far apart, the Matrix ceases to exist. So, like, we have them just close enough in their little pods, but, like, somehow keeping them literally 10 feet apart is powering the Matrix as if they have some weird actual magnetic attraction to each other. I don't know. I thought that was stupid. I think the atomic bomb when they touch hands is stupid. I think Trinity being able to fly is stupid. I think also my understanding, okay, this is one of the reasons I didn't give it as harsh of a judgment when it came to the world building, because I just watched the other three. My understanding is Neo is the chosen one for the old Matrix. So how can he fly in the new one?
Well, so I think that was supposed to be part of the premise of this one, is you see him trying to fly and do these things that he can't really do in this one, and the question is supposed to be why. And the real truth is that Trinity is the chosen one in this Matrix, not Neo. I think there's a couple of problems with that. One, Neo ends up flying at the end anyway, so he becomes the one again. So much for that being the premise. But secondarily, you don't have the build-up for Trinity in this one like you do for Neo in the previous one, where the entire first one is this question: is Neo the one? And in a lot of ways, this gets undermined and questioned in the first one to the degree that he's going, I'm not the one. And then he's trying to get out as he's about to get destroyed by the agents chasing him because he can't escape, right? That is part of the first one. And it's a critical part of the first one where he ends up rising up and becoming the one in the critical moment, right? And we had the whole discussion on whether or not that the way he becomes the one is questionable. If you're curious about that, just watch that review. We go deep into that. But in regards to this one, you don't have that for Trinity. Trinity just becomes the one out of nowhere, and it isn't so much a build-up that's believable. It feels more like a deus ex machina. It feels like a situation where she is just given the power to become the one out of nowhere and then just solves all of the problems. And it because you don't have that build up, because you don't have it develop in that way, I don't think it's organic. I think it feels like it comes out of nowhere for a reason, and it's just not it's it's not believable. It's not good storytelling. It's just not good.
I agree. Anyways, that was my question, because he definitely starts flying towards the end. My theory is that Kujaku was invisible and was holding up Trinity, but side note, that's the best character in this film. Kujaku.
For those of you who are wondering, it's like Kujaku's just like a robotic bird. Yes,
he didn't die either, by the way.
Kujaku, where you at? No. Yeah, it's so unfortunate because in some ways, I mean, I'm not going to say Neo or Trinity, excuse me, is the best character in the series. I think she adds more, especially in the third one compared to the previous ones. But in this one, she falls very hard from where she had come from previously, if you buy her development previously. Obviously, Andrew didn't, and we had all discussions on that. But in this one, I think we're both in agreement that Trinity is developed in she's like a damsel in distress for a good portion of the film. And she's just sitting there having all these things happen around her, and then out of nowhere, she becomes the hero of the day. And that just isn't conducive to creating the compelling plot for what we're seeing, especially because when you have the protagonist, and the protagonist's goal is to accomplish the story goal, and his goal is to save the damsel in distress in this situation, he doesn't do that. The damsel in distress ends up saving him, and maybe you want to say, well, that's a modernistic worldview portraying on the big screen. Okay, well, then just make Trinity the protagonist from the start. Don't make Neo the protagonist from the start. And that honestly probably would have been more interesting, to be honest, is if Trinity was the one who was trying to save Neo the entire time. But I don't know. I don't know if you have more to say on that, but that might honestly be enough browbeating on Trinity.
Yeah, I mean, not much there. I just keep thinking about the fact that literally no one dies in this film, at least no one that matters. It's like a science fiction film without the science fiction, or a horror film without death. Like, what are we even doing? Like, the Matrix films historically have been ones in which it's a war for humanity's survival, and what better way to portray that than having humanity being killed off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you really don't get that. I mean, you don't get that at all, especially because in this film, humanity isn't at stake. In the first three films, humanity's at stake. But in this one, what you get is a little side tangent where Niobe talks about how now the machines are fighting each other. And then that just goes off into the netherworld and disappears for no clear reason. So humanity's not even at risk at this point. It's just this one desire of Neo where he goes, I want my long lost love and I must have her. And that is the only thing driving this film after he gets freed from the Matrix.
Also, I'm curious to hear your thoughts here. I feel like the movie's entire existence undermines the first three by having Neo not be dead.
Yeah, and for you as the audience, the premise there is that the analyst took the bodies of these two characters and basically says that they did die, and then he recreates them using the modern technology and machinery to create organic material to recreate their brains, recreate every aspect that was damaged during the previous fights, and then resurrects them to be alive for the purpose of recreating this new perfect matrix that is based more on playing on people's emotions than on the logic-built system of the previous matrix. I think, yes, in some ways it undermines the third one. I think they did well enough, which I was surprised I would come to this conclusion, but I think they did well enough at explaining how they were created that I could buy it, right? I didn't think that it was unbelievable, which I thought it would be, because you see the end of the third one, you go, oh, there's no way Neo could come back. How are they going to make this fourth one? It doesn't make any sense. And so when I saw commercials for the fourth one coming out back in 2020 and 2021, I was like, that's weird. I don't know how this is going to work. And from the very start, I was skeptical of this film. And of all of that, that part wasn't the most critical part for me. I thought that they did well enough that it made sense. I think that could it be argued that it undermines it? Sure. I think the other aspects of the film undermine it more. The existence of Agent Smith, the creation of this new Matrix that's totally disparate from the previous Matrix, how a good portion of most of the characters from the previous films just aren't in this film anymore, you know, whether that's Morpheus or the original Hugo Weaving as Agent Smith, etc. You can argue about Niobe, and we'll get to her in a second, but overall, there's so much that's not connected to the previous one that it feels like a separate, almost like a what if universe type movie rather than a true continuation of the series.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, what are your thoughts on Niobe? She is one of the few characters that does appear in the previous films that reappears in this one. Do you think she is compelling as a side character? What are your thoughts?
I thought she was terrible. I think this is also a perfect example of like there being no consequences in this film, because Neo directly defies her, and then she basically just goes, "I'm so mad at you, you're a naughty boy, but we're gonna go save Trinity."
I think this was the first thing, because this shows up probably, halfway through the film?
Yeah.
Where she's mad at Neo for what he's doing, and then she does exactly that. She says, you're in trouble, and then she goes, never mind, we're going to save Trinity, because that's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Why? I don't know, because like she said previously, her main priority is saving the people at Io and keeping them alive. So why is she doing this? It's not clear. But it's another situation where she provides a unique dichotomy to the universe that we didn't have previously, where she is saying, no, we shouldn't save people from the Matrix because it's only going to cause us more problems. And it would have been interesting if they continued to go along those lines, except for then they just take that side idea and throw it away.
Yeah.
And they do that, multiple times in this film. We already talked about that with the original premise that we said was interesting in the first third of the film. They also do that with the war between the machines. Like, that's a very interesting aspect of the universe. What did they do with that? Nothing. Or the idea that the machines and humanity are working together. That's also interesting. They develop new technology. What are they going to do with that? Well, really, once again, nothing. Except for Morpheus and his whole thing. They end up doing something with him. But technology as a whole, they don't really use it in a way that adds to the film in a meaningful way, especially in regards to the messages they're trying to convey, the themes they're demonstrating, because they're kind of even hinting at that one in the third film, where they talk about this idea with the other programs and how they feel trapped as well, and how there is an oppression beyond just the oppression of humanity that is occurring in this universe. Okay, so what's going to occur now that they are aligned? Well, they end up going on this mission to save Trinity. Okay, it's just not clear. It was an interesting idea that they didn't really do a lot with. They didn't do a lot with that. They didn't do a lot with Niobe. They didn't do a lot with this brand new Matrix and taking those interesting ideas and fully developing them to their conclusion. Instead, they get side punted for the sake of this love story that they wanted to tell. So that's what you get. What are your thoughts on Bugs, which is probably the only other critical main side character, if you will, in the story? She's the more or less a new leader in Io. She's in charge of one of the ships that they run, and she is the one who's in charge of freeing Neo and then also helping him to free Trinity later in the film.
Terrible character. I have no emotional connection to this character. I have no reason to care if she lives or dies. I have no reason to believe that she adds anything important other than the fact that we have other characters in the film telling us that she is and saying that she's needed to, like, wake up Trinity. Like, functionally, she does nothing. Neo comes to the conclusion that he needs to get Trinity and do whatever he needs to do on his own or with the help of Morpheus. He would have gone and left the city anyways, absent her character. Like, I don't think she is adding anything to this film, if not just taking away from it. Same thing with, like, the reintroduction of Agent Smith.
Yeah, she's a yes woman in the story. She just goes for the sake of helping out Neo and then says a few pithy lines, but her development in regards to any interesting ideas, which is one of the key themes that the Matrix series is known for, is the idea of what is real, what is fake, the themes and ideas that they're trying to develop in here. Even if whether or not you disagree with whether or not the story is compelling, the ideas they present is what originally made the story a core piece of some of culture and cinema, is how they took these interesting ideas and developed them. And that's done through the characters and what they talk about and what they're trying to portray as they go through this struggle, as they go through this adventure. And she just doesn't have one. She is just there to help push the plot along, and she doesn't add anything as a consequence. So, once again, a big L. Same thing with the Morpheus character. Okay, it's a robotic recreation of Morpheus based off of some character that was pulled out of a Matrix version. Okay, what does that do? Well, he helps the good guys. Okay, cool. Once again, not adding anything to the film except for removing Lawrence Fishburne from his rightful place as Morpheus.
Yeah.
With all that being said, do you think they tried to develop some interesting themes, especially with character development? Do you think that you talked a little bit about how you don't think their arcs developed. Do you think that that's true by the termination of this film? And are there themes here?
If there's themes, they're present, and the portion of the movie that I said I liked. Absent that, it's just the love conquers all theme, which we've discussed in depth here. We think it's stupid. I think it's stupid. I don't think it actually adds to this film. And I think that there's a reason we've only gotten a fourth one and nothing else, because this movie was so bad and did so terribly, so...
Yeah. The theme of what is true and what is not, which has been a critical part of at least the first two films for sure, is just a side idea in this film rather than being a core component of it. The resisting the tyrannical systems aspect is just classically portrayed and stock portrayed as a consequence. And it went back to the themes of love that were reminiscent of the first two, right? Where the third one goes into this broader understanding of love for humanity as a whole. The first two is very much Neo is in love with Trinity, and that's driving everything. So in some ways, this film does go back to that, but the way it terminates is, I was in love with Trinity at the beginning, I'm in love with Trinity at the end. How does Neo develop? He doesn't. How does Trinity develop? Well, the wool is pulled out over her eyes and she sees the truth, and that's that. So and it sounds kind of trite. Maybe you might say, oh, well, they're short shafting the film because they're saying it's simple when it's more complex. No, it's really not. It's really not. Like, this film is very basic in the story it portrays and the ideas it's portraying as a consequence. And the reason that we are bashing it so hard is because they didn't really develop these ideas any more than we had already seen them developed in the previous films. So it's not going anywhere and teaching us or trying to make us think about anything that we hadn't already seen previously. So, anyways, with all of that being said, do you think this film is going to have a lasting impact?
No, even less so than the second and third ones. I was looking over some of my ratings for these things, and I realized, I think the Hater and Andrew is a much better version of myself than the version that is on this podcast right now. My revised review is probably going to be a 1.4.
Okay.
That's being a little generous.
Let's just cut that rating in half, why don't we?
I wanted to give it a 0.4, but I thought to myself, and I realized I gave Joker Foyer Adieu a 0.8, and this is not worse than that, because nothing will be worse than that viewing experience. So, we're going to give it a little bit more. And I think it does some things, right? I talk about that one portion of the movie where I'm like actually interested, and they could have actually done stuff with it. And there are some redeeming qualities. They're very few and far between, though. And like a 1.4 is still an absolutely atrocious rating.
Yeah. And you wonder why they developed the film in the way that they did. And some of that has to do with, I believe, leaving open the opportunity to create future films, especially if this one did well. And that's where you have the introduction of characters like Bugs, the recreation of Morpheus under this new guise, this idea that, well, we could continue the series and take it somewhere if this film does well. Well, guess what? It didn't. And you know why it didn't? Is because those characters that you reintroduced as new characters, or sorry, didn't reintroduce, you introduced as this new Morpheus, as Bugs, they weren't interesting. They didn't add anything to the film. They were simply plot points to move the plot forward. And so, sure, in regards to keeping the story true to the original premise, in regards to having Neo there and having Trinity there, you did better than some other films, like we talked about with Tron Ares, but not by much. And so were people impressed? No, they weren't. And as a consequence, it's not going anywhere. If they see another one of these coming out, I don't know if it's going to be watched. I won't watch it unless it's for this podcast.
Yeah. I honestly think this serves as an example of where certain franchises or series, they need to have a definitive stopping point. And I think Matrix, despite the fact that, like, if you've listened to the other 3 reviews on the other Matrix movies, I'm not the biggest fan of them. I still think they're decent. I think the first one is probably the best, even though I think I gave it technically a lower rating. But like, it had a definitive end. It had a complete arc. We didn't need another one. I think the same thing goes for Tron too. Like, even though I love the world of Tron and the character of Tron, I think that franchise, they had one movie and they did a really good job with the follow-up. The follow-up was phenomenal. But it had a definitive arc. You had the character of Kevin Flynn die and his son take on his company, embrace his role as his successor. You had the grid literally collapse in on itself. We didn't need another one. There are plenty of more other movies like this. I think Back to the Future would be another one where if they rebooted it, it would be terrible. The only reason I would watch that would be for the podcast. Whereas there are other universes where it's like, you know what, you can probably build more here. And as much as I hate a lot of what Disney's done with Star Wars, I think Star Wars is a great example of that. It's a massive universe. There are so many different stories you could tell. The difference with Disney is they don't know how to let the Skywalker saga rest. They want to keep doing stuff with the Skywalkers. But it's like the Skywalkers are just such a small fraction of the galaxy that you have, and there's so much more out there. And so it's like, even in the world's universe, or the settings and world that, I'll just say settings, the settings in which you have so much you can do, these big Hollywood movie companies want to hyper focus and fixate on the things that have already been done and just recreate them. And that's where you get movies like Matrix 4, where you get movies like Tron Ares, where you get movies like 7, 8, and 9, instead of just doing something else that is interesting in a time period we haven't explored yet, with characters that we don't know yet, and building almost from the ground up. So,
yeah. And you see the proof in the pudding for that example, with situations where they did test out other ideas and they worked well. For example, the Clone Wars series, right? Even though it starts off especially as a kids show, and the first couple seasons are pretty much, there's a reason it's for, age 7.
Yeah.
They're there, and they proved to be successful because they developed these ideas that had already existed in the universe, and they dealt with, for the most part, different characters and developed different ideas that didn't exist previously in the core 6 films that we have seen, and developed them well. And then they took that and ended up going with Star Wars Rebels, and that also did well. And that was even less detached to the Skywalker saga than what we had seen with the other ones. And they go with other things where they had The Mandalorian, which The Mandalorian did fairly well. And I think there's some fairly redeeming aspects of that series. Or Andor, which Andor is fantastic, right? Or Rogue One, right? These other films ended up being successful, and they didn't have to be part of this core story that they were telling.
You know what is interesting, though? I think Mandalorian suffers when it starts to call back to the core story. Is when you start to get them calling back to characters like Boba Fett and Luke Skywalker, and you get this Baby Yoda character, and you keep wanting... It's like Disney can't help themselves. It's like they're an addict, and they're trying to stay clean for a bit, and they have something really good, and then they go, but what if we added this? But what if we added that? What if we made the Ahsoka TV show, and we started calling back to all of these other things? And it's like, we talked about this before. You either have the one end where they're just, all they can do is call back, harken back to the golden age, or they try something new, but they do something so completely outlandish and it does terrible, where they go, oh shoot, that was terrible, let's just go back to the drug.
Well, yeah, and you see that the Mandalorian's a perfect example of that, simply because the introduction of that first initial arc with Grogu and the Mandalorian, I don't think was bad on its face. This idea that the Mandalorian has to deliver this baby child to the Jedi. I think in some ways it has some flaws, but overall the arc itself is not bad. The problem is that they decided they still needed this Baby Yoda to exist, and so they ended up bringing Grogu back after Grogu's arc was already done. Grogu was supposed to go to the Jedi, and they decided, you know what, no, his place belongs with the Mandalorian, so let's bring him back with Pedro Pascal and have them go on more adventures, because everyone wants to see Baby Yoda more. And that's when you start to have problems, when you can't let something go and move on with the story to some other arc. You have problems.
Yeah.
And these media companies just can't get this in their head. They can't figure this out, and I don't understand why.
And it's crazy, because you get shows like Andor where the director said, I only have material for 2 seasons. I will not be making more. I will do what I need to in those 2 seasons, and that will be it. I'm not going to be sitting here trying to get as many lightsaber battles in or big name characters in. For the most part, all of the characters are original, aside from Mon Mothma, who's barely in 4, 5, and 6. She shows up in 3. And then Cassian, who's only in Rogue One. Same thing with K2. Those 2 characters, and K2SO shows up for the last 3 episodes. You get all this new ensemble of characters, all revolving around the character of Andor and his backstory. And what you're really focusing on isn't even Andor. It's just this immersion into the world of the grittiness and the tension that is within the foundling stages of the rebellion, and really amping up the horror and terror around the presence of the Empire. So They did really well with that, but I don't know if they'll ever be able to recreate it with the way things are going. Maybe the new Maul show that's coming out has potential to do that. I have some hope, but I'm also very hesitant with the way things have been going lately. So,
yeah, we'll see if Dave Filoni can resurrect Star
Wars. Well,
it's
not even Filoni. It's Sam Witwer who's mostly heading that project. But yeah. Oh, because he's in charge. Is he in charge of Star Wars now? I don't know.
Yeah,
all I know is Kathleen. Okay. Yeah, I know Kathleen Kennedy stepped down, but all that to say, back to The Matrix, I think it's a perfect example of movies that should not have been made in the first place.
Yep. That's what you got. So hopefully they do not make a 5th one, but that remains to be seen. So that's what we got. We hope you all enjoyed. We'll be back, as we always are, next week. We'll see you all then.